Ethan Blackwood's feet barely touched the polished floor of the airport as he hurried through the terminal, his thoughts consumed by the chaos of the past few days. The business trip had been more draining than he'd anticipated, filled with late-night meetings and early morning calls. His body ached from the constant pressure, and all he wanted was to get home, slip into the comfort of his penthouse, and escape into the silence he'd come to crave. But as he made his way toward the baggage claim, his steps faltered. Across the terminal, a woman stood holding a child by the hand. The boy, no older than 3, tugged at her sleeve, and she gently guided him toward the waiting area. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and the world around him blurred as his eyes locked onto her. Clara, his ex-wife, the one person he had once believed was his everything. The one person he had loved so deeply, yet had ultimately pushed away. Their marriage had been filled with intensity, but that same intensity had destroyed them. Yet, seeing her now, standing there, older but still undeniably beautiful, sent a shockwave through his chest. Ethan's mind spun with disbelief. Clara looked just as she had all those years ago, the same calm grace in her posture, the same soft features. The child in her arms, however, was an unfamiliar presence. He hadn't expected this. It had been years since their divorce, and they hadn't spoken in months. He had no idea she had a child. The boy's features were angelic, round cheeks, big, curious eyes that seemed to see everything. He was adorable, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at Ethan. For a moment, Ethan's feet didn't move. He just stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to process what was happening. His mind couldn't grasp the reality of it. What was Clara doing here? With a child? Was he imagining things? He blinked, and when he opened his eyes, she was still there. The rush of emotion was overwhelming. It wasn't just surprise. It was a strange mixture of nostalgia, anger, and something else. A deep, aching emptiness he hadn't realized he still carried. Clara, noticing his gaze, froze for a split second before her lips parted in a slow, cautious smile. It was the same smile she had once given him when they first met, full of warmth and promise. But there was no warmth in her smile now, only uncertainty. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice still carrying the same soothing tone it had when they had shared their lives together. "I didn't expect to see you here." Ethan cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. His emotions were a tangled mess, surprise, disbelief, and even a hint of anger that he couldn't explain. "Clara," he finally replied, his voice tight. What are you doing here? And who is this?" The child, sensing the tension, clung closer to Clara, peeking up at Ethan with wide, curious eyes. For a moment, the boy said nothing, simply watching him with an almost unnerving intensity. Clara's smile faltered slightly, her eyes darting toward the child before she glanced back at Ethan. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice quieter now, filled with a sense of urgency that Ethan hadn't expected. The world around them seemed to fade away as Ethan nodded stiffly, still trying to understand what was happening. His chest tightened as he followed her through the terminal, the sounds of the airport muffled in his ears. The child's small hand grasped Clara's, his innocent footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, the knot in his stomach tightening. He had always believed that Clara was a part of his past. He had closed off, something he had buried beneath his relentless ambition and drive for success. But now, seeing her again, with a child by her side, all those buried feelings resurfaced. The anger he had once felt toward her for the way their marriage ended. The disappointment in himself for not being able to fix what had gone wrong. Everything came rushing back. They finally found a quiet corner, away from the hustle and bustle of the terminal. Ethan stood there, unsure of what to say, while Clara gently placed the child on the ground, giving him a small toy to distract him. The boy immediately bent down, focused on the toy, his small fingers working to push it along the floor. Ethan's mind raced. Who was this child? Why had Clara kept him a secret? He couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off, that there was more to this encounter than a mere coincidence. Something told him that the answers Clara was about to give would change everything. "Clara, what's going on? Why didn't you tell me about him?" Ethan asked, his voice low and filled with a mix of frustration and confusion. His gaze never left the child, trying to make sense of the situation. Clara met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice trembling slightly. "Ethan, there's so much I need to explain." And just like that, Ethan's world shifted. Everything he thought he knew was about to unravel. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on Clara, his chest tightening with every passing second. He couldn't understand what was happening, what had brought her back into his life after all these years. And more importantly, who was the child? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. But Clara's silence, her reluctance to answer his questions, only deepened the mystery. The boy, oblivious to the tension in the air, continued to play with the toy, his small hands pushing it back and forth across the floor. Ethan's gaze flickered between the child and Clara, his thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and hurt. There was no doubt that the boy shared some of his features. His eyes, the shape of his jaw, the way his lips curved when he smiled. But it couldn't be possible. It couldn't. Clara cleared her throat, her fingers nervously tugging at the sleeve of her jacket. She looked as though she was trying to find the right words, but the weight of the past seemed to hang heavily between them. Ethan knew that look all too well, the way she used to stare at him when she was unsure of how to approach a difficult subject. He had seen that look countless times during their marriage, each time an unspoken plea for understanding, for forgiveness. "Ethan," Clara said softly, her voice breaking the silence, "I never wanted you to find out this way." Her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. He had never expected to hear those words from her again, not after everything that had happened. The pain of their divorce, the bitterness that had followed, the way they had both retreated into their own lives after the end of their marriage, it all seemed like a lifetime ago. But now, standing in front of her, those memories felt like they were still fresh, still raw. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Ethan asked, his voice strained. "Why keep this from me all these years? Why didn't I know about him?" Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't look away. "I couldn't, Ethan. I couldn't bring myself to tell you. It wasn't just about him. It was about everything we were, everything we lost." Ethan felt a sharp pang of frustration. He had always known that Clara had struggled with the pain of their separation, but hearing her speak of it now, after all this time, only stirred up more questions. How could she have kept something so important from him? How could she have kept their son, a son he never knew about, away from him? Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You know how it was between us. We were falling apart before I even knew I was pregnant. We were both so consumed by our work, by the endless expectations we placed on ourselves, that we stopped paying attention to each other. And when I found out I was pregnant..." She trailed off, her eyes searching for something to latch onto, but there was nothing but the quiet hum of the airport around them. Ethan's mind reeled. He had known their marriage was in trouble. He had known they were drifting apart, that their priorities were misaligned. But hearing Clara speak so openly about it now, admitting that she had been carrying their child in the midst of their crumbling relationship, shook him to his core. He had always been so focused on his career, on building his empire, that he had neglected the most important thing in his life, his family. And now, standing in front of him was the consequence of that neglect. A child he didn't even know existed. "I never wanted him to grow up without a father," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "But I didn't think you were ready for that. I didn't think you would be able to handle it with everything you were dealing with. And I couldn't bear the thought of raising him on my own and still hoping in the back of my mind that you would come back, that we could somehow make it work. But I was wrong, Ethan. I know that now." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, and he could feel the raw emotion behind them. It was clear that Clara had struggled with this decision, with keeping their son a secret from him. But what hurt the most was that she had never given him the chance to be a part of their lives. She had made the decision on her own, without ever considering how he might have felt about it. "I didn't want to hurt you," Clara whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't want to make things worse between us, but I couldn't stand to be the one to tell you something you weren't ready to hear. I thought I was protecting you." Ethan closed his eyes, a wave of emotion crashing over him. The anger he had felt earlier was gone now, replaced by something deeper, something that gnawed at him, something that made him question everything he thought he knew. He wasn't angry anymore, not at Clara, not at her decision. But the feeling of being left in the dark, of having so much kept from him, was something he couldn't easily shake. "I should have been there," Ethan said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I should have been there for you, for him." Clara nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I know, Ethan, and I'm sorry." The boy, who had been quietly playing with his toy, suddenly looked up at them, his eyes wide with curiosity. For a moment, he seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, the tension that had filled the space between them. He reached out, tugging at Clara's sleeve, and she gently lifted him into her arms. "His name is Lucas," Clara said softly, her gaze never leaving the child. "Lucas Blackwood." The word struck Ethan like a lightning bolt, and for a long moment he could only stare at Clara in stunned silence. Lucas, his son, the boy he had never known. And yet, in the brief instant that their eyes had met, Ethan had felt an undeniable connection. There was no mistaking it now. The boy was his. Clara's voice brought him back to the present. "Ethan, I know this is a lot to take in, but please, I need you to understand. I didn't want to keep him from you forever, but I didn't know how to tell you. And now he deserves to know his father." Ethan's heart clenched. He had come here expecting nothing more than to escape the stresses of his life. But in this quiet corner of the airport, he had learned the most unexpected of truths. He had a son, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for this new chapter. But one thing was clear. He was going to be a part of Lucas's life, no matter what. He looked at Clara, his gaze softening. "I want to get to know him," Ethan said quietly. "I want to be there for him. But I don't know how to do this, not after everything that's happened." Clara nodded, understanding the depth of his words. "We'll take it one step at a time," she replied. "But we can't undo the past. We can only move forward." And with that, the weight of the past seemed to lift, if only slightly. They both knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, they were no longer strangers. They were two people bound by a child who would change everything. Ethan sat in stunned silence, the words Clara had spoken still echoing in his mind. Lucas, his son, a child he had never known existed. The weight of the revelation was almost too much to bear, and yet, as he watched the small boy nestled in Clara's arms, a strange sense of connection began to take root deep inside him. Despite the shock, there was something undeniably familiar about him. His features, the bright, curious eyes that seemed to reflect Ethan's own, the curve of his lips, the way he tilted his head as he looked up at Ethan. There was no mistaking it. The boy was his. Clara gently rocked Lucas in her arms, her eyes soft as she watched him play with a small stuffed animal. It was clear that she had been protecting him for years, shielding him from a world that had never known him. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Why had Clara kept Lucas from him for so long? What had happened between them that had led to this secret being kept from him all these years? Ethan's gaze remained fixed on Lucas, the boy's innocent face now imprinted in his mind. He could see the echoes of himself in the child, and yet there was so much he didn't know, so much that Clara hadn't told him. His heart ached with the uncertainty. What had this boy experienced without him? What had Clara gone through, raising Lucas alone? As though sensing Ethan's gaze, Lucas looked up, his small fingers wrapping around the stuffed animal, his bright eyes locking onto Ethan's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The child said nothing, but there was something in that silent exchange that made Ethan's chest tighten. Clara watched the moment pass between them, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "He's a smart kid," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been through a lot. But he's strong. He reminds me so much of you." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. She had just said the one thing he hadn't been able to admit to himself. He was Lucas's father, his flesh and blood. And yet, he hadn't been there for any of it. The boy had grown up without him, without the one person who should have been there from the very beginning. Ethan felt a surge of guilt rise within him. How could he have allowed this to happen? How could he have let so much time pass without knowing his son, without being there for him? Clara seemed to sense his inner turmoil. She shifted slightly, her hands gently adjusting Lucas in her arms. I know it's a lot to process, Ethan, she said, her voice filled with empathy. I didn't want to keep him from you. I wanted you to be a part of his life. But when everything fell apart between us, I didn't know how to make it work, and I didn't want to bring a child into that chaos. I thought I could handle it alone. Ethan felt a pang of understanding, but the frustration still lingered. Why didn't you trust me? He asked, his voice tight. Why didn't you think I could handle it? Clara looked down at Lucas, her fingers brushing through the boy's hair. It wasn't about you, Ethan. It was about me. I wasn't sure I could trust myself, let alone you. I didn't want to drag you into my mess. You were already drowning in your own world, in your work. And I was scared. Scared of being alone. Scared of raising him without you. But most of all, I was scared that you'd leave us behind. That you wouldn't want to be part of his life. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. It was the truth, he realized. Clara had been alone, trying to navigate the challenges of motherhood while carrying the weight of their past. But he wasn't some distant stranger. He was Lucas's father. And despite all that had happened, despite the years of silence between them, he couldn't ignore the undeniable bond that now existed between him and this child. Opening his eyes, Ethan took a slow, deliberate step toward Clara. His gaze never left Lucas, the small boy who had been a part of his life from the moment he was born, even if he hadn't known it. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the need to protect this child growing with every passing second. I'm here now, Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. I want to be a part of his life. I want to make up for lost time. I know I can't change the past, but I can be here now. For you and for him. Clara's eyes softened, and a small tear slid down her cheek. I didn't expect you to say that, Ethan. I didn't think you'd want to be a part of our lives after everything that happened. Ethan shook his head, his jaw clenched with determination. You were wrong, Clara. I've missed out on so much, but that ends now. I'm not going to walk away again. I'm going to be here for both of you. For a long moment, Clara didn't speak. She simply stared at him, as if weighing his words, searching his face for any hint of doubt. But there was none. Ethan meant it. He would be there for them. And as he looked at Lucas, he knew that no matter what it took, he would find a way to be the father the boy deserved. Finally, Clara nodded, her lips trembling as she smiled. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. You don't know how much that means to me, to both of us. Ethan reached out, gently brushing a lock of hair from Lucas's forehead. The boy looked up at him again, his eyes wide with curiosity, but there was something new in them this time. Trust. It was a small thing, but it was enough. Ethan had taken the first step toward becoming the father he should have been all along. As Clara shifted Lucas back into her arms, Ethan took a deep breath. There was so much left to figure out, so much pain to work through, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. The past couldn't be undone, but the future was still unwritten. And with Lucas now in his life, that future felt a little brighter. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to Clara. But Clara heard him, and she gave a small nod, as if to say she believed him. And in that moment, something shifted between them. A subtle understanding, a quiet promise that despite everything, they were in this together. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be bumps along the way, but they were starting something new, together. The atmosphere between Ethan and Clara was heavy with unspoken tension. The weight of the revelation about Lucas's true identity still hung between them, a silent barrier neither of them had fully confronted yet. As the moments stretched on, the sounds of the bustling airport faded into the background, and all that existed was the quiet corner where they stood, just the three of them, Ethan, Clara, and Lucas, whose innocent gaze occasionally flickered toward Ethan, as if trying to make sense of the complex emotions playing out before him. Clara shifted Lucas in her arms and glanced at Ethan. She took a deep breath, her eyes filled with both uncertainty and resolve. We should talk. Really talk, she said softly, her voice low enough to ensure no one overheard. I know you're angry, Ethan, and you have every right to be, but there are things I need to explain, things you don't know. Ethan's jaw tightened as he met her gaze. He had questions. So many questions, but above all, he was struggling to understand why Clara had kept him in the dark for so long. The pain of that secrecy gnawed at him, and he wasn't sure how much more he could bear. Still, he nodded. He needed answers. Lucas deserved to know the truth, even if it meant confronting the painful past that neither of them had fully dealt with. "All right," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let's talk. But Clara, I need to understand why. Why you didn't tell me. All these years. What happened? Why didn't I know about Lucas?" Clara closed her eyes for a moment, her expression faltering as if the question alone was too much to bear. She shifted her weight, stepping back slightly, her hand still gently holding Lucas. After a moment, she exhaled slowly and motioned toward a quieter area near the terminal seating. "Let's sit down," she said. "We're not going anywhere for a while." They walked together, the tension between them palpable as they made their way to the empty chairs. Lucas, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, clutched his stuffed toy and followed them, his small feet patting softly on the floor. He was a reminder of everything Ethan had missed, of everything that had been kept from him. And yet, there was something undeniably innocent about the boy, something pure that made Ethan's heart ache with both love and regret. Once seated, Clara placed Lucas on her lap, his small hand instinctively reaching for hers. Ethan sat across from them, his arms crossed over his chest, the lines of his face drawn in frustration. He was still processing everything, still trying to reconcile the image of the man he had been with the father he now needed to become. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had been in love with Clara, and now all that was left were questions. So many questions. Clara broke the silence first, her voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted to keep him from you, Ethan. I swear I didn't. But after everything that happened between us, I didn't know how to bring a child into it. When I found out I was pregnant with Lucas, I was terrified. You were so focused on your career, and I couldn't see how I fit into your world anymore. We were falling apart, and I didn't want to make it worse. I didn't want to trap you into a life you didn't want." Ethan's eyes softened, the anger he had felt earlier giving way to something else. A deep, aching sorrow. He had always been focused on his work, too consumed by ambition to see what was happening around him. But to hear Clara speak so openly about her fears, about the isolation she must have felt, made him realize just how blind he had been. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had failed to see the cracks forming in his personal life. "I didn't even know you were pregnant, Clara," Ethan said, his voice low. "How could I have known? You never told me. You never gave me a chance to be there. I would have." Clara interrupted him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want you to feel obligated, Ethan. I didn't want you to resent me, or Lucas. I knew you were already overwhelmed by your responsibilities, and I didn't think you'd want to add being a father to that list. I didn't think I could ask you to take on that burden." Ethan's heart clenched as he listened to her words. She had been protecting him, in a way, but also herself. She had been protecting her son, too, even if it had meant keeping him away from the man who should have been there from the very beginning. He wanted to be angry, to demand answers, but the truth was that Clara had acted out of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being alone, fear of not being enough. "I wasn't the man you needed me to be, was I?" Ethan's voice cracked, the rawness of his emotions threatening to spill over. "I wasn't there for you, for either of you. I was so consumed with my own life that I didn't even think about what was happening outside of it. And now, here we are. And it's too late to change anything. You've already raised him without me." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back, her expression one of quiet resolve. "It's not too late, Ethan. You're here now. And that's what matters. I didn't want you to miss out on his life, but I also didn't want to force you into something you weren't ready for. I didn't want to make things worse." Ethan's hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he struggled to find the right words. He had spent so much time building walls around his heart, pretending that he didn't need anyone, that he didn't need Clara. But looking at her now, holding their son in her arms, everything seemed different. The walls that had once felt like protection now seemed suffocating. "I want to be here, Clara," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to be a father to Lucas. I've missed so much, but I want to make up for it. I want to know him. I want to be part of his life. No more hiding. No more running away. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with both hope and caution. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he could be the man she had once loved, the man who could stand by her side and help raise their son. But trust was a fragile thing, and she wasn't sure if it could be rebuilt so easily. I'm not asking for anything from you, Ethan, Clara said quietly. I just want you to be there for him. For Lucas. That's all I've ever wanted. Ethan nodded, a promise forming on his lips. He didn't know how everything would unfold, how he would fit into this new reality, this new family. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going anywhere. He was going to fight for his son, for his place in Lucas's life. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. Ethan sat frozen in his seat, the weight of Clara's words pressing down on him, as if the entire world had shifted beneath his feet. He's your son. Clara's voice reverberated in his mind, her words taking on an almost surreal quality. He had never imagined this moment, the realization that Lucas, the child who had captivated his heart in an instant, was his flesh and blood. But how was this possible? His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle trying to fall into place. The timeline didn't add up. The night they'd separated, the bitterness and anger that had poisoned their relationship, it had all happened before Lucas could have been conceived. Hadn't it? He shook his head, trying to make sense of it, but it was like trying to solve a riddle with missing pieces. His eyes drifted to Lucas, who was now sitting on the floor, his back to them as he clutched his stuffed animal. The boy was so full of life, so full of energy, and yet here he was, the result of everything Ethan had failed to see. How could this be? Ethan finally whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. His gaze never left Lucas, as though hoping the answers would be written in the child's small face, in his innocent eyes. He longed to understand, to make sense of what felt like a dream, a beautiful but impossible dream. Clara's hands were trembling as she smoothed Lucas's hair back. I didn't know how to tell you, Ethan. I didn't know how to explain it. When we split, I wasn't sure how to face you. I didn't know what to do. And then when I found out I was pregnant, I thought I had lost the chance to ever tell you. I didn't want to tell you something you wouldn't be able to bear. I didn't want to burden you with it. Ethan's mind spun as the realization began to sink in, but a surge of frustration boiled inside him. Why hadn't she come to him sooner? The rage that had simmered within him since the moment he first saw her again now flared, though it was tainted with confusion. Why had Clara kept this secret from him? And why had she kept Lucas from him all this time? I'm sorry, Ethan. I know this must be overwhelming, Clara continued, her voice cracking with emotion. But you need to understand, I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't want you to feel trapped by something you weren't ready for, and I didn't want you to be angry with me or resent me for it. Ethan closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose, as if that might somehow stop the flood of emotions threatening to overtake him. Anger, confusion, pain. These feelings swirled around inside him, making it hard to think straight. He had always prided himself on being in control, on managing every situation with precision, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. Nothing had prepared him for the weight of being a father to a child he had never known. I don't even know what to say, Ethan muttered, the words choking him. His gaze flicked to Lucas again, the boy's playful laughter filling the air, and his heart twisted with a sharp pang of longing. He had missed so much, so many years. He had failed this little boy, failed to be there when he was needed most. Clara looked down at Lucas, her voice softening. I didn't want him to feel abandoned, Ethan. I didn't want him to think he was unwanted, especially when you weren't here to help raise him. He deserved more than that. The sadness in her voice hit Ethan like a physical blow. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't about his pain or his confusion anymore. It was about Lucas, the child who had lived without the love of a father, without the support of the man who should have been there from the beginning. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight with the weight of everything Clara had just shared. I should have been here, he whispered, more to himself than to Clara. I should have been there for both of you. Clara's eyes softened as she looked at him. Ethan, you couldn't have known. I didn't let you in. I didn't give you that chance. The room seemed to quiet around them, the hum of the airport fading into the background as they both sat there in this moment of unspoken understanding. Ethan reached up, running a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. There was so much he needed to say, so much he needed to understand. But for now, one thing was clear. He had to be a part of Lucas's life. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future. "I need to know him, Clara," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "I need to make up for everything I missed. He's my son. I'm not going to let him grow up without knowing his father." Clara's eyes filled with emotion, the pain and regret of all those years spent apart reflected in her gaze. She had been carrying this burden alone, and now, for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. "I want that too, Ethan," she replied softly. "I want him to have you. I want him to know you. But we have to be careful, Ethan. This is a lot for him and for both of us. I need to know you're ready for this, for him." Ethan nodded firmly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll prove it to you, Clara. I'll prove it to Lucas." A long pause stretched between them. Ethan could see the flicker of uncertainty in Clara's eyes, but there was something else there now, something like hope. And as she looked down at Lucas, he knew that they had crossed a threshold. There was no going back from this moment. They were going to build a future for Lucas, one step at a time, no matter how difficult it might be. "Let's take it slow," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. "But we'll do this, together." Ethan's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and excitement. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, it felt like they were on the same page. He wasn't just a man lost in his past anymore. He was a father, a part of something bigger than himself. And as he looked at Lucas, still playing innocently on the floor, he knew this was only the beginning. He had a lot to learn, but he was ready for the journey. "I'll be here, Clara," Ethan whispered. "For both of you, I won't let go of this." Ethan's mind was still reeling from the shock of the revelation. And even as he sat beside Clara in the quiet airport corner, the weight of the moment felt almost unbearable. The child, Lucas, who had seemed so familiar in the most unexpected of ways, was now undeniably tied to him. Yet there was more to their story, so much more that Clara hadn't told him yet. As the minutes passed, the silence between them felt suffocating, heavy with the unspoken truths that neither of them had dared to face until now. Clara glanced at him, her eyes filled with an intensity that showed she was wrestling with the emotions of her own. She reached for Lucas, pulling him closer, pressing a soft kiss to his head as he continued to play with his stuffed animal. The little boy, blissfully unaware of the adult drama unfolding around him, gave a small giggle. His innocent joy a sharp contrast to the complex emotions swirling in the air. "Ethan," Clara began, her voice steady but filled with a quiet sorrow. "There's more. I've kept more from you. It's not just about me not telling you about Lucas. There are things I've never shared with you, things that I've kept locked inside because I didn't know how to tell you, how to make you understand." Ethan's pulse quickened. It had been difficult enough to process what had already been revealed, but now it seemed as though the floodgates were opening. He felt his chest tighten, both in anticipation and in fear of what was yet to come. He wanted answers, needed them, but the truth was already proving to be more than he had bargained for. "Clara," Ethan said, his voice rough. "Whatever it is, just say it. I need to know. I can't keep walking in circles, trying to make sense of things that aren't clear." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, as though trying to gather the strength to speak. When she opened them again, there was a rawness to her gaze, an openness that made Ethan feel as though he were seeing her for the first time in years. The woman who had once been his wife, his equal, was now a mother, a woman who had borne a heavy burden in silence. And she was finally ready to share the weight of that. "It wasn't just that we didn't work, Ethan," Clara began softly. "The divorce wasn't the only thing that tore us apart. There was something else, something I didn't think I could ever say to you. You remember how we ended things, how everything seemed so final, so irrevocable?" Ethan nodded, the memory of their bitter separation still clear in his mind. He remembered the cold silence that had followed their argument, the way they had both turned away from each other without a word. He had been so focused on his career, on building his empire, that he hadn't even seen how far Clara had fallen from him. And now he had to face the painful truth that his neglect had contributed to the destruction of everything they had once shared. Clara inhaled deeply, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag as she spoke. You weren't just busy, Ethan. You were absent. You were lost. We were supposed to build a life together, and instead, you built a world that didn't include me. You didn't even notice when I was slipping away. You didn't notice when I was alone, even when you were standing right beside me. I tried so hard to make you see me again, but you never did. Ethan's throat tightened. The sting of her words hit him harder than he'd anticipated. He had always known that their marriage had been strained, but hearing Clara speak with such vulnerability made him realize just how deep the wounds had gone. He had been blind to her pain, so wrapped up in his own ambition that he hadn't seen the silent cries for help. Ethan began, but she held up a hand to stop him. No, just let me finish, she said, her voice quieter now but firm. After we divorced, I thought I could move on. I tried to. I tried to make a life for myself. But when I found out I was pregnant with Lucas, everything changed. I couldn't keep carrying this burden alone. I had no idea how to raise a child by myself, especially when I felt so disconnected from everything. Myself, my past, even you. It was too much. But I couldn't let go of the idea that Lucas deserved more. He deserved better than what I could offer him. And he deserved to know his father. Ethan looked down at his hands, clenching them into fists as he struggled to swallow the lump in his throat. He had been the one who left, the one who had turned his back when Clara had needed him most. He had thrown himself into his work, thinking that success would fill the empty spaces in his life, but it had only made him more isolated, more detached. He hadn't even considered the possibility that Clara was struggling, that she might have needed him too. I didn't know, Clara, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know you felt that way. I didn't know how far I'd pushed you away. Clara looked at him, her expression a mixture of pain and understanding. I didn't know how to make you see it, how to make you feel what I was feeling. And then, when I found out I was pregnant, I knew that I couldn't go through it alone. Not again. But I didn't want you to hate me for it. I didn't want you to resent me for something that was supposed to be a beautiful gift, not a burden. So I did what I thought was best. I kept Lucas away from you. Ethan felt his chest tighten as the weight of her confession settled in. She had been acting out of fear, fear that he would reject her, fear that he would resent Lucas, that their son would be nothing more than a reminder of the failures of their past. It broke his heart to realize just how much pain she had endured on her own, without him. I never wanted that, Ethan said hoarsely. I never wanted to make you feel like you were alone, and I never wanted to keep Lucas from you, or from me. I was just so wrapped up in my own world that I didn't see you slipping away. I didn't see what was happening until it was too late. Clara didn't speak right away. She let his words hang in the air, her eyes studying him as if she were trying to determine whether he was truly ready to take responsibility for the man he had become. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke again. I can't change the past, Ethan, and neither can you. But Lucas is here now, and he deserves to know you. He deserves a father, a real father, not a man who's only there when it's convenient or when he feels like it. He deserves to see you, all of you, the good and the bad, and I need to know you're ready for that. Ethan nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But he was ready. He had to be. For Lucas, for Clara, and for himself. I'm ready, he said quietly. I'm ready to be the man you needed me to be, the father Lucas deserves. I'm not perfect, Clara, but I'll do whatever it takes. I'll make up for the years I lost. And as Clara met his gaze, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, a cautious trust that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been broken all those years ago. But they would do it together, for Lucas, and for the future that was waiting for them. The weight of everything that had been said hung heavily between them. The truth Clara had revealed was so much more than Ethan could have ever anticipated. And as he sat there, grappling with the revelation of his son's existence, a myriad of emotions flooded his mind. Anger, betrayal, guilt, but more than anything, an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He had to come to terms with the fact that Lucas was his son, and despite the years that had passed, he could no longer ignore the bond that tied him to this child. Clara had been right. He had been absent in more ways than one. But now, faced with the undeniable truth of his son's existence, he could no longer afford to stay lost in the past or in his own excuses. This was his chance to change things, to be there for Lucas and for Clara. He stared down at his hands, feeling the cold sting of regret, but also the warmth of newfound resolve. The past could never be undone, but the future was still within his grasp. If there was one thing Ethan knew for certain, it was that he couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't let the pain of their past prevent him from being the father Lucas deserved. "I'm not going to walk away from this, Clara," Ethan said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. He met her gaze, determination in his eyes. "I won't be the man who abandons his son. Not again. I know I've made mistakes, more than I can count, but I can make things right. I'm going to be there for him. I'm going to be the father he needs." Clara's expression softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She had been so wary, so protective, but now, there was a subtle shift in the way she looked at him. Maybe she was beginning to believe in the possibility of change, in the possibility of redemption. "I'm glad to hear you say that," Nat Clara replied quietly. "But you need to understand, this isn't going to be easy. You can't just step in and act like everything will be okay. It's going to take time. Trust has to be rebuilt, and that's not something that happens overnight." Ethan nodded, fully aware of the enormity of what he was promising. He had failed them both before, and while he couldn't undo the past, he was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. For Lucas, for Clara. "I know," he said softly, "but I'm willing to try. I'll prove it to you. I'll prove it to him." Clara gave a small, uncertain smile, as though she wanted to believe him, but wasn't entirely convinced. She looked over at Lucas, who was still playing with his toy, his innocent laughter filling the quiet space around them. The sight of him, so unaware of the complex web of emotions unfolding in his parents' lives, was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "Okay," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I need you to be patient. Lucas, he's never known you. He's never had a father. It's going to take time for him to get to know you, for him to understand who you are." Ethan's heart ached as he looked at the little boy, so full of life and joy. He could only imagine how much it would take to build a relationship with him, to earn his trust. But he was determined. He had to be. "I'll take it slow," he assured her. "I'm not going to rush this. I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The air between them seemed to settle a little, the tension slowly easing as they both understood the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't just a chance to reconnect with Lucas. It was a chance to rebuild something that had been lost, to heal the wounds that time had made so deep. Clara glanced at him again, this time with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She was still cautious, still unsure of how to navigate this new chapter in their lives, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward. "You'll need to spend time with him, Ethan," Clara said softly, her voice laced with both tenderness and caution. "Get to know him. He's not just going to accept you right away. He's been through a lot, and I've tried to protect him from all the pain. I don't want him to be hurt again." Ethan nodded. "I understand. I won't push him, but I'll be there when he's ready." Clara took a deep breath, as if finally coming to terms with the shift that was happening. She had been carrying this secret for so long, and while the revelation had rocked her world, there was something undeniably freeing about it now. The weight of the truth was no longer hers to bear alone. Ethan was here, ready to take his place as Lucas's father. And while there were still many unknowns, she couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. "I'll help you," Clara said, her voice softer now. "I'll help you both, but you have to promise me something, Ethan." "What is it?" he asked, leaning forward. "Promise me that you won't leave again. Promise me that you won't disappear when it gets hard. I'm not going to be the one to pick up the pieces again. I can't do it alone anymore." Ethan's heart tightened, and he looked at Clara with sincerity. "I promise, Clara. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time since their painful separation, Clara allowed herself to believe that maybe they could find their way back to each other, even if it wasn't in the way they had once imagined. There was still so much healing to be done, so many mistakes to be mended, but they were at the beginning of something new. And for Lucas's sake, they would do whatever it took to make it work. As they sat there in the quiet of the airport, their conversation moving into the details of the next steps, there was a palpable sense of change in the air. What had once been broken seemed, for the first time in a long while, like it could be rebuilt. Ethan was ready for that challenge. He had a son to get to know, a family to rebuild, and a future to carve out, no matter how difficult it might be, and he would not let them down again. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind of change for Ethan. Each day brought new challenges, but also unexpected rewards. His relationship with Lucas was growing, albeit slowly. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience, vulnerability, and a deep, unwavering commitment to making things right. At first, Lucas had been wary of Ethan. The little boy had never known his father, and Ethan couldn't blame him for being hesitant. Clara had raised him on her own, and Lucas had never questioned the absence of a father figure in his life. But now, with Ethan making an effort, trying to step into a role that had been vacant for so long, things were slowly starting to change. Ethan was careful. He never rushed. Every interaction was measured, thoughtful. He made sure not to overwhelm Lucas, respecting his boundaries while showing him that he was there for him, that he wasn't going anywhere. They spent time together in simple, quiet ways, playing in the park, going for walks, reading books. Little by little, Lucas started to warm up to him. His smiles grew more frequent, his laughter louder. Ethan couldn't help but feel his heart swell with pride each time Lucas looked at him with those wide, trusting eyes. But it wasn't just about earning Lucas's trust. It was about learning what kind of father he wanted to be. As the days passed, Ethan found himself reflecting on his own childhood, on the father he had once dreamed of becoming, the man who had focused solely on his career, who had ignored the need for real, lasting connections with the people who mattered most. That man seemed so distant now, as if he had lived in a past life. Now he was more present than ever. He watched Lucas grow, celebrated every small milestone, the first time Lucas rode a bike, the way his face lit up when he solved a puzzle, the way he eagerly shared his new discoveries. These moments were becoming a part of Ethan, filling the emptiness he hadn't even realized existed. Ethan's relationship with Clara, too, had begun to shift. Though their conversations were still cautious, there was a growing sense of mutual respect between them. They were learning to communicate again, to trust each other. And while it wasn't easy, there was a sense that they were finally moving towards something better, something different from what they had before, but still meaningful. One evening after putting Lucas to bed, Clara and Ethan found themselves sitting together on the couch, the quiet of the night wrapping around them. The television was on, but neither of them seemed to be paying attention to the screen. Instead, they were talking. Really talking. For the first time in years. "I never thought I'd see this day," Clara said, her voice quiet but steady. "I never thought you'd be back. I didn't think you'd care enough to try." Ethan looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of his past mistakes. He had failed her. He had failed them both. But hearing her say those words, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, made him realize just how much he had to make up for. And yet, as he sat beside her, there was a sense of peace that came with knowing he was trying, truly trying, to do the right thing now. "I don't blame you for feeling that way," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't there when I should have been. I walked away, and I didn't look back. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Clara didn't respond immediately. She sat quietly for a moment, her gaze distant. But when she finally spoke, her words were softer, almost wistful. "I've always wanted what's best for Lucas," she said, her voice tinged with both tenderness and caution. "And part of me wanted to keep him away from you, to protect him from the hurt you caused. But now, I see the way you're trying. I see the way you're with him. And it makes me believe that maybe you can be the father he deserves." Ethan felt a rush of gratitude in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not fully, but it was a start. The walls between them, which had been so thick and impenetrable for so long, were beginning to crack. little by little. "I'll prove it to you," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'll show you that I can be the father Lucas needs, and that I can be the man you deserve." Clara met his gaze then, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, the years of resentment, of hurt and confusion seemed to melt away, replaced by something new, something that might, in time, become trust. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to believe that they could heal, that they could move forward, together, as a family. But the road ahead was still long. There were many more hurdles to overcome, many more obstacles in their path. Yet in that moment, sitting in the quiet of the evening, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He was not the same man he had been when he left. He was stronger now, more determined. And as long as there was a chance to be the father Lucas needed, to rebuild what had been lost, he would take it. He turned his attention back to the sleeping form of Lucas down the hall, a sense of peace settling over him. There was still so much to do, but for the first time, he felt ready. He was ready to embrace fatherhood, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. And with each new day, he would prove to Clara and to himself that he had changed, that he was capable of being the man they all needed him to be. And slowly, as the days passed, that hope grew stronger, as if a new chapter in their lives had already begun to unfold. The days seemed to stretch into weeks, each one blending into the next as Ethan and Clara settled into a new routine. Lucas had slowly come to accept him as part of his life, but there were still moments of hesitation. Every now and then, the little boy would retreat into the safety of Clara's arms, looking up at Ethan with the same wide-eyed curiosity that Ethan had seen on his own face when he was a child. But the bond between father and son was growing. Fragile, yes, but undeniable. It wasn't just Lucas who was changing. Ethan had begun to see the world differently. His work no longer consumed him with the same fervor. The thought of coming home to Clara and Lucas, seeing Lucas's joyful face and hearing his innocent laughter, made him realize how empty his life had been before. The realization was almost painful, but it was also a blessing. Ethan was beginning to understand the depth of the connection that had been missing for so long. One evening, as he sat in the living room with Clara, the peaceful atmosphere was broken by a sudden ringing phone. It was Clara's phone, and she looked at it with a mixture of concern and hesitation before answering. Ethan watched her, a tight feeling growing in his chest as he sensed that something was wrong. "Hello?" Clara's voice was steady but low. Ethan's curiosity piqued, and he couldn't help but notice the way Clara's face shifted as she listened to the other end of the line. Her eyes widened slightly, and her mouth tightened in a way he had come to recognize as a sign of distress. She was trying to remain composed, but something was happening, something that made her look deeply troubled. Clara held up her hand, signaling that she would be right with him, and stepped into the next room. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but he could hear her voice rising in pitch, her emotions slipping from control. After a few tense minutes, she returned, her expression pale. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice low and strained. I don't know how to say this, but there's something you need to know about Lucas." Ethan stood up, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. He had become so used to the idea that he was Lucas's father, so used to the idea that they were beginning to build something real, that the news Clara seemed to be holding back felt like a weight pressing down on him. "What's going on? What do you mean?" Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't read. Fear, maybe, or guilt. She hesitated before speaking again, as if weighing every word she was about to say. I had a DNA test done, Ethan, a few weeks ago. After you came back into our lives, I wanted to be sure. I needed to know if you were really his father." Ethan's stomach dropped. He had suspected there was more to the story, but this was beyond what he had imagined. The child he had come to love, the son he had grown attached to, was now being questioned. The thought was like a dagger to his chest, and for a moment he couldn't find his breath. "Clara, what are you saying?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible as he tried to understand the gravity of what she was revealing. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. "I did the test because I needed to know, and the results came back. Ethan, Lucas is not your son." The words hit him like a physical blow. Ethan stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to process what Clara had just said. The world around him seemed to slow, the room spinning as he tried to find his footing in the midst of the shock. "What?" he whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. Clara's face was pale, her eyes filled with tears. She wasn't looking at him directly now. Instead, she was staring down at her hands, wringing them together in a nervous, almost desperate gesture. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I had to know. I didn't want to make any promises that weren't true. I thought you had a right to know." Ethan felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. He had spent so much time convincing himself that Lucas was his, that the little boy he had been spending so much time with, bonding with, was truly his son. But now, the truth was staring him in the face, and it was impossible to ignore. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Ethan's mind raced, questions piling on top of questions. If Lucas wasn't his son, then who was? Why had Clara kept this from him for so long? And how would he ever come to terms with the fact that his connection with Lucas, his entire relationship with the boy, had been based on a lie? "I don't understand," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "If Lucas isn't mine, then whose son is he? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Clara's expression was torn, as if she were struggling with her own guilt. "I didn't know who the father was. I couldn't be sure, Ethan. There were too many unknowns, too many mistakes. I wasn't sure what to do. I was trying to protect Lucas. But I should have told you. I should have never kept this from you." The words fell like bricks, heavy and final. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than Clara was letting on. "What do you mean, mistakes, Clara? What happened?" Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she wiped away a tear. "There was someone else," she whispered. "Someone from my past. A man I never thought I'd see again. He was Lucas's father." Ethan's mind reeled at the revelation. His heart hurt, but he didn't know why. Was it because of the lost time with Lucas? Was it because Clara had hidden the truth from him? Or was it because he had allowed himself to believe in a future that now seemed uncertain? For a long time, neither of them spoke. The truth hung in the air between them, suffocating and heavy. Ethan had to force himself to breathe as he tried to make sense of the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, filled with a quiet intensity. "Who is he, Clara? Who's the father?" Clara's eyes filled with guilt as she took another step back, her face a portrait of regret. "It's complicated, Ethan, and you may not like the answer." Ethan braced himself for what was to come, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but the truth was still beyond his grasp. Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as Clara's words echoed in his mind. "Someone else, a man from my past." The weight of the revelation hung over him, pulling at his insides. He felt a sense of betrayal, but more than that, there was an overwhelming confusion that clouded his thoughts. What did this mean for him? For Lucas? For their future? The room was quiet, too quiet, and every second felt like an eternity. Clara's face was pale, her eyes brimming with unspoken emotions, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to look away from her. This was the moment of reckoning. The truth had been exposed, and there was no going back. "Clara, who is he?" Ethan's voice was tight, edged with a blend of frustration and disbelief. Clara took a long, shaky breath, looking down at her hands as though she were trying to summon the strength to speak. "His name is Marcus. Marcus Collins. He was someone I met a long time ago, before I even met you." She paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't want to tell you this. I didn't want to bring him into our lives, especially after everything we went through. But Lucas deserves to know. He deserves to know the truth about where he came from, and so do you." Ethan's mind was reeling. The name, Marcus Collins, meant nothing to him. He'd never heard of the man before, and that only added to the unease building within him. But there was something else now, something deeper, a feeling of loss that he couldn't quite explain. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's thoughts were racing as he tried to make sense of it all. He had come to love Lucas as his own, and nothing could change that. But what did it mean that the child he had come to care for was not biologically his? Was there still room for him in Lucas's life? Could he continue to be the father figure the boy needed? "Ethan, I know this is a lot to take in," Clara said, her voice soft. but you've been such an important part of Lucas's life, and that won't change. Whether or not he's your biological son doesn't change the love you've shown him, the bond you've built. I'm asking you not to walk away from him." Ethan looked at Clara, his eyes full of conflicting emotions. He had been wrong, hadn't he? He had spent so much time blaming the past, trying to piece together something that felt whole, something that could fill the empty spaces in his heart. But now, looking at Clara and hearing her words, he realized that maybe it didn't matter whose blood ran through Luca's veins. What mattered was the love they shared, the future they could still build together. "I don't know what to think right now," Ethan said quietly, "but I do know one thing. I can't just walk away. Lucas is my son. In every way that counts." Clara's eyes softened, relief flooding her expression. She reached out and took his hand, her grip tight. "Thank you, Ethan. That means everything." But even as he said those words, Ethan knew the road ahead would not be easy. There were still many hurdles to overcome, still many emotions to process. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He could move forward. He could accept what had happened, no matter how painful. And most importantly, he could continue to be the father that Lucas needed, no matter what. Days turned into weeks, and as time passed, Ethan found himself more and more involved in Lucas's life. They spent their days together, playing, laughing, sharing moments of joy. Ethan didn't care that Lucas wasn't his by blood. The bond they had was real, forged in love and trust, not in genetics. And that was enough. As for Clara and Ethan, their relationship had transformed as well. They were no longer the angry, hurt individuals they had been when they first separated. There was still tension, still unspoken pain, but there was also understanding. They were learning to co-parent, learning to work together for the sake of Lucas. They were finding a new rhythm, one that felt healthier, more honest than it ever had before. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But they were willing to try, to rebuild what had been broken. One afternoon, as Ethan sat with Lucas in the park, watching him chase after a ball, he couldn't help but smile. The weight of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the secrets, the heartache, seemed to fade away, replaced by the simplicity of the moment. Lucas was running toward him, his face lit up with a smile that could rival the sun. "Daddy! Daddy! Catch!" Lucas yelled, his small voice full of excitement. Ethan held out his arms, laughing as Lucas threw the ball in his direction. It was a simple game, a small moment in time, but for Ethan, it felt like everything. In that moment, he knew that no matter what secrets the past held, no matter what twists and turns their story might take, he had found something that was worth fighting for, something that was real. And as he caught the ball and tossed it back to Lucas, the weight of his past mistakes felt just a little bit lighter. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. The future was uncertain, yes, but together, they could face whatever came their way. And that was all that mattered. As the days turned into months, the wounds of the past slowly began to heal. The journey had not been easy. There were still moments of doubt, lingering questions, and the occasional bitter memory. But one thing had become undeniable. They had built something stronger than the secrets, stronger than the pain. They had built a family. Ethan looked back on everything that had transpired, the shock, the confusion, the anger, and realized that none of it mattered in the face of what they had now. What mattered was the love they had found in each other, the unspoken bond that had formed between him and Lucas, and the quiet understanding that had emerged between him and Clara. Lucas had become his son in every way that counted, and that was a truth far greater than blood. It was the moments they shared, the laughter, the tears, the quiet evenings spent together, that defined their family. Ethan didn't need a DNA test to prove what was already in his heart. And Clara, though still haunted by the past, had found a new sense of peace. The weight of her choices had not been easy to carry, but she had made amends in the way that mattered most, by giving Ethan and Lucas the chance to build something beautiful together. They weren't perfect, but whoever was. The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead would have its challenges. But as Ethan stood in the park, watching Lucas run toward him, his heart was full. He knew now that life was about the choices they made, the people they loved, and the moments they held on to. And as he crouched down to embrace Lucas, pulling him close, He realized that no matter where life took them, they had already found what they needed: each other. Together, they would face whatever the future held, stronger than ever before. Thank you so much for following along with this story until the very end. Your time and attention mean the world to me, and I hope you enjoyed the journey we've shared together. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated on more stories like this one. Your support helps me keep creating, and I truly appreciate every single one of you. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. See you in the next one.